I'd like to open this evening with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tōnga. Kia makina ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he hoka, e hao hu, te hei maariora. I chose that karakia for the imagery that it conveys that seemed quite appropriate to the proceedings tonight, and for the genesis of this book, which I will talk about, and then we're going to have Peter and Grant talking to us. But I'll give you the translation. It's not a literal translation, but it's one that conveys the meaning. Cease the winds from the west, cease the winds from the south. Let the breeze blow over the land, let the breeze blow over the ocean. Let the red-tipped dawn come with a sharpened air, a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious day. Behold, there is life. And to me, that conveys the idea of sort of getting rid of the distractions and calming the space so that we can receive something new this evening. Now, I want to tell you a bit about what I saw about the genesis of this book, because I've been working alongside Grant for a while. In August of last year, 200 people gathered at Waitangi to celebrate the bicentenary of the arrival of Richard Davis and his family in the Bay of Islands. And Grant and I were two of the speakers. Davis is Grant's and my ancestor in common. So in the lead up to that gathering, Grant had the great idea of transcribing all the journals for Richard Davis, and then he got a little bit enthusiastic and went on and did a few more, because we were referring to those for our research, and we thought it would be great if we had better access to them and made that access available to other researchers as well. So that was Grant going down to the Auckland Library, camera copying every page, then he'd send me a bundle of JPEGs, and we would do an OCR transcription into Word. And for some of the pages, that worked okay. If they were clean, they were double-spaced typing, just select, copy, paste, check, next page. But some of them were not. They were single-spaced, they had cross-outs, and when you did the select, you could see a whole lot of words didn't pop up, and they jumbled them all in order, and so it was a big job going through and correcting, filling in the spaces, and sometimes completely retyping. I suppose I was rather task-focused, and I was just plugging on, get these pages done. And I would mark some of the pages if I thought that was something I wanted to go back to and use in my research. Whereas Grant got rather captivated by one day in 1825. But it was a contrast, this thing about sweeping away the distraction of the work that I was focused on, and he had seen this page that I really stepped over the top of. So when you do an exercise like that, you engage in a really close reading. And Grant just got stuck on this page, and you saw so much in it that I hadn't picked up. But it was a simple conversation on the surface of it. A group of Māori and a group of missionaries, and one of the missionaries was translating the conversation, English into Māori, Māori into English, and then another missionary was writing them down. So it was a recorded conversation, not as we record it today with a camera. But there was that snippet that I saw Grant really grasping and wanting to run with. Now, other historians have used that snippet as an example or evidence for the work that they're doing, but in Grant's case, he was focusing on the conversation itself. And the other night, I think it was Jeff, talked about a microhistory, and I think I might call it a microscopic history, something under the microscope. And then when you do that, you see all this detail, but you can also sort of pan out and see where that came from. And in so doing, I think, Grant, you used your listening skills. It was a conversation that you were actually listening to rather than just reading, to reveal a bigger picture. So that, to me, was letting the red-tipped dawn come with a sharpened air. So Grant can tell you about his story in a little while. I'm going to turn to Peter to make his comment first, and then you can just follow us.
Thank you.
Now, Peter will be known to many of you, and to those who don't know, he's emeritus professor from Massey University, where he taught for 40 years. In retirement, he works as chair of the Ethics Committee of Auckland University of Technology and continues to publish and do a whole lot of other things. And probably like all of us, you think, how on earth did I fit work into my day? Peter was appointed a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2019, New Year Honours for services to religious history and community. He has published extensively, starting with his early independent publication of There We Found Brethren, 1977, which was when you were doing your PhD at Sussex University. Explored the development of Brethren assemblies in New Zealand. He's undertaken research and published on new religious movements, such as Destiny Church, and the histories of the Brethren, Protestantism, evangelicalism, ecumenism, Methodism, and Anglicanism, a very broad spectrum. And all of these have been underpinned by the doctoral studies at the University of Sussex, where Peter completed his PhD in 1978. And that research focused on the 18th and 19th century British Protestant sects, which it covers the time period that Grant is talking about. Researchers have also benefited enormously from the religious history of New Zealand bibliography that Peter has compiled and probably still are compiling online. It's a first stop for anyone who's researching in the field. Peter was founding and long-serving secretary of the Religious History Association in New Zealand from 2001. He's been a regular commentator on religious matters in New Zealand in the media, and is really the go-to guy for commenting on any matters that come up in the moment. I first met Peter probably around 2002, soon after the Religious History Association got up and running. I found him an engaging speaker at those conferences. And talking to some of the master's and PhD students he has supervised, they felt privileged to have been mentored by him. I was therefore delighted to work with Peter and with Alan Davidson between 2009 and 2014 on the history of the Auckland Anglican Diocese, the bicentenary commemorative conference on the beginning of the CS mission in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the publication of Te Rongopai, which came out of that conference. I'd say that professionalism is not an adequate description for Peter. He's just a great guy to work with. in all respects. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on Grant's publication. You may.
Thank you.
Go.
Okay, I might stand because you'll hear me more clearly if I stand, I think. It's really a delight to speak at the Auckland launch of this book. I know you've already had one launch in Wellington, and in a place which is so redolent of Anglican history. We're looking at a conversation that exactly 2 centuries ago, think of that, took place and speaks so profoundly of the relationship of Māori and missionary. What I love about this book, it's a tiny little book with a glimpse of one conversation, but it captures something which it seems to me so many people don't get right. That is the complexity of the encounter between Māori and missionary. By no means a one-way transaction. And that's what the book emphasizes and clarifies, I think. By using and exploring a particular moment, Grant is able to capture the ambivalence and the positives and the negatives of the robust exchange between Māori and missionary, which to my mind explains the factors in the debate that must have gone on in many Māori about would they convert to this new religion or not, showing that it's complex, it requires careful reflection and examination. I quote from page 7 of I think it's the preface of the book. This conversation offers evidence of the missionaries' sincere respect for Māori, despite their evangelical eccentricities, Anglo-centric bias, and semi-conscious assumptions of cultural superiority. On this occasion, they listened to and heeded the perspectives of the rangatira they were meeting. In turn, though staunch in their defence of and adherence to traditional cultural values, the rangatira demonstrated a remarkable tolerance and willingness to consider the implied rebukes of the missionaries' words, which they accepted as motivated by araha. That, I think, is the key insight of the book, and I think it's an incredibly helpful insight. Grant sees it as a tipping point in the relationship. I'm not so sure whether it was a tipping point, but I think it's an interesting indication of how things were at this moment. I want to talk briefly about the thesis which Malcolm Falloon completed in 2020, which is entitled The Māori Conversion and 4 Early Converts. Now, Malcolm Falloon looks at the first 4 converts as he sees them. Sorry, I just need to stop that phone call. He starts with, he calls it the conversion of Ruatara, though I doubt if it can really be described in that way. Then he talks of somebody I'd never heard of before, Maui, who went to the UK and connected with the very notable Anglican evangelical Basil Wood, and would appear to have probably been the first Māori convert, but in Britain, where he died in 1860. And then he talks in detail of the conversion of Rangatiratanga, the brand plucked from the burning, as Henry Williams described him, who was baptised, I think, the day before his death, on the 15th of September 1825, and then the conversion of Rawiri Taifanga in February 1830, which marks the great moment of the tipping point when very large numbers of Māori were converted from that point. Now, what's interesting is that Falloon's argument, especially for the chapters on Tarangi, focus also on a group of conversations, 10 conversations to be precise, And Falun goes through these conversations in great detail and includes the text of them in an appendix. So the first conversation begins somewhere between September and November in 1823, and it takes place at Waitangi, and it's between Henry Williams, William Fairbairn, who I think must have been the translator throughout this group of conversations, and what later turns out to have been a group of Māori, among which is Tarangi, that very first convert in New Zealand. So here is the description that Henry Williams gives of it. The following is the substance of a conversation we had some time ago at a village a mile distant. Remember, he's in by here, so that makes sense. Which was exceeding pleasing to me, both from the interest the party expressed and also from the picture they composed, the great variety of countenances which were assembled as I had yet beheld, young and old, chiefs and slaves, sick and blind, or nearly so. Mr. Fairbairn and myself, having taken our station on the ground, the people formed a circle, and then he proceeds to describe this conversation in which they touch on the great atua, as they describe God, and trust Henry Williams, the need to observe the Sabbath, which he of course places on a higher plane than the conversion of the people. The first step would be the observation of the Sabbath. Then they're back on Good Friday in 1824, and again it's Fairbairn, Williams, and I take it Tarangi, but also some of Tarangi's family. Actually, Tarangi is probably missing on that occasion because he says the great chief is absent. Again, I think Fairbairn is obviously the translator, and in the conversation, which is totally one way, and that's the difference between your conversation and this, Williams just pushes endlessly for the briefest comments back in return, the logic of what the death of Jesus meant and the resurrection of Jesus. Then they're back on the 17th of October to discuss the subject of death with another rangatira, Hepatahi is his name. And then there's a further discussion, and the rangatira explains, justifying why there's very little interest from the people. They did not care about such things. All they thought of was eating and drinking and fighting. That had he told them, they would not have come. He said, if we'd come to talk about anything else, or to give tokens, that's items of trade, we should have had numbers. So, that is a point where you had to attract people to come along to the conversation. So it's a very intriguing description of a gradual shift in Māori opinion that's there in these discussions. Then by the fifth meeting, they further talk to Rangi, and in Dialogue 6 there's a chief from Tauranga who has never heard this kind of conversation before and is totally confused. Here, our old friend, the old chief, Te Rangi I presume, remarked with considerable energy that if Shunghi, as that's the way that Hongi is described often in these papers by the Europeans, and some other head chiefs were to believe, they would have plenty of followers to listen to them, as they now have to go to the fights. So the distraction of the musket wars, has got them completely disinterested in this missionary circumstance. However, by Dialogue 7, Rangi is very sick, and from 7 to 10, there is an increasing focus upon his sense of the fear of death. And on the brink of death, there's a long description of his decision to be baptized. And then in the final dialogue that Falun reports in his thesis, they talk to his widow about what has happened. And that's on the 2nd of October, 1825. And just 2 months later takes place the conversation that you report, although with slightly different assembly of missionaries, and and a different translator. And that may be significant. So I think undoubtedly though, word, even if this is in Kerikeri, word would have spread of what had happened at Waitangi 2 months earlier. But equally, plenty of discussions about the slaves that they brought back when they returned from the fighting. And, as we see, the building of the ship in Pahia, which you cleverly find in that conversation. And, as you say, the respect for the fact that they built the house, that Paki has helped build the house for Hongi on the marae at Kerikeri must make a difference. So this meeting at Kerikeri, with its frank discussion, is one of any number of conversations that must have taken place. And the different members who take part in those conversations, I think, reflect different tones, different people, but also follow somewhat similar trends. It's very interesting then that the primary reason that the meeting seems to have been called, and very carefully called, Henry Williams is going to come over to George Clark's house to be there for this discussion because he's very concerned at this way in which Ngāpuhi are going off to fight wars in the south, and he wants to stop the warfare. And I mean, it seemed to me one could imagine Henry Williams, remember the naval man with his experience in Napoleonic warfare, he knew all too well the destruction of warfare, and his alarm at the possibility of death, his concern about the consequences for Māori society in the bloody sequence of events that we call the Musket Wars, and the hint of peacemaking that Williams and others will take on at a later stage, and that's very intriguing. I'm so interested to listen to Jeff Troughton's comments at the Wellington launch on that very subject. But then, of course, we have William Gilbert Paki there providing the translation, and Richard Davis writing the summary of this conversation. So there are different players to some extent than the Fairbairn Williams sort of total control, which I think is quite significant because Williams kind of dominates the way we think about missionaries in the 1820s anyway. And Paki, with his background that Adrian has so delightfully described when you've done the journal of his father and his uncle, and that extraordinary story of the LMS missionaries who end up in a rather sorry state in Sydney, but he does work as the carpenter at Pahia for a significant period. And William Gilbert Paki, of course, refuses to go to Waipu and insists that he's going to stay right here in the Bay of Islands. It's quite intriguing. Grant, you describe something I never thought about before, that the translator is the facilitator of the conversation. And that is a very interesting insight, where, I mean, Henry Williams' Māori can't have been great. He would have followed very little of the conversation, maybe. But Paki, with his intuitive grasp of Māori, playing a key role in the translation committee for the Bible, is able to help. And I think you've helped me to see how significant that is. And then you enter into the subtlety, the complexity of the encounter, and I realise that what lacks in my background, I have never been a counsellor. And the counsellor can see fascinating dimensions in this conversation that, as you indicated, Adrian, there's something there in the interchange where careful listening shows up some of the dimensions which turn in the end on the missionaries wanting to hear from the Māori, accepting that the missionaries came with araha. And that becomes if you like, the ending of the conversation. Now, I noticed with great interest that this is book 3 in an 11-volume series, which you haven't yet quite finished, but that's the ambition.
Yes.
That you, and I'm so pleased that you and Adrian are working together, because Adrian's done such marvellous work on the LMS and the CMS and many of those dimensions. And Paki and his significant role, maybe played down sometimes, but Paki was just as important as his colleague Matthews, I think, in Kaitaia. And of course you work on the economic dimensions of missions. And I remembered, Adrian, that I spoke at your own book launch back at St Luke's in 2018.
Yes, 2018, right.
And the fascinating story of that Paki tradition. You know, we're at a time when there's quite a lot of debate goes on about the relationship and the role of missionaries in the early history of Aotearoa. And there have been quite contrary discussions of the same encounters. You can take, say, Alison Jones's fascinating book, Words Between Us, which are largely, in her interpretation, words that do not really meet, that there's, as she sees it, almost complete misunderstanding so often. On the other hand, there's Tony Ballantyne in Entanglements of Empire, which shows so many interconnections and reminds us that missionaries weren't anything to do with the colonial encounter, and yet they were everything to do with the colonial encounter, and that's the difficult bit that we need to grapple with. The flags flying over the mission station were in some way connected with the British Empire, and in some ways completely independent from it, with their own unique CMS cross, which of course became the flag of the independence, of the Maori independence in 1835. So, Grant, I think this little book, in its tight, neat, in conclusions, this wonderful title that Grant uses for the final section of this, I think marvellously expresses the exploration that each side is having with each other, and this hinge on what is the attitude of each to each, and the fascinating exploration of how, firstly, Rangatiratanga becomes, of all things, gentlemanship, the way that it's translated by Paki, it seems, and the way that aroha binds the two together. Thank you so much for what you've done.
Thank you.